90.3 WHPC now presents Law You Should Know. The law affects every aspect of our lives, our home, our jobs, and our recreational activities. Now, learn about the law and how to protect yourself against the loss of your liberty or property, and learn how to stand up for your rights and seek compensation when you have been wronged. Your host for Law You Should Know is attorney Kenneth J. Landau, a past dean of the Nassau Academy of Law, and frequently lectures to lawyers on ethics and avoiding problems with clients, and to the public on how to choose and use lawyers. This is Law You Should Know on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hi, this is Ken Landau, and welcome to Law You Should Know. Today's program is about the Anthony Lester Fellowships being offered by Bard College to both law students and lawyers early in their careers. And to tell us more about this and the deadlines and the criteria is his daughter. And I'd just like to welcome Maya Lester, who's a barrister in England, for being our guest on Law You Should Know, and to talk to us more about the fellowships in honor of her father. Maya, welcome to Law You Should Know.
Thank you so much. I'm hugely grateful for the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me. You're
a practicing barrister in Great Britain, and you go by the title of King's Counsel. And for our American listeners, perhaps you can explain what the designations are of King's Counsel and Queen's Counsel and how they are conveyed to you.
Absolutely. So in the United Kingdom and a few other countries around the world, we divide our lawyers into barristers and solicitors. The nearest equivalent of a barrister is probably a sort of mixture between a trial lawyer, litigator, and an appellate lawyer. So we basically are the ones who stand up in court and speak to the judges. Solicitors work in law firms like most US lawyers do and have more contact with the client. So the senior barristers are called now King's Counsel. When the Queen was alive, they were Queen's Counsel, and then overnight we all changed from QC to KC. I mean, that's a title that has been conferred on senior barristers since the 16th century. I think it dates from Elizabeth I's reign, and at the time it was those barristers appointed by the monarch to act as legal advisors and court advocates. And I guess it has maintained that sort of designation to this day. So it does feel wonderfully old-fashioned.
Let's segue to the work of your father and the honoree of the purpose of this fellowship is to honor his work in the field of human rights and the rule of law. And of course, he had a connection with Bard College in New York, and we'll come to that in a moment. So tell us about the work of and the legacy of your father, Anthony Lester.
Well, my father was in the United Kingdom a human rights, he was a barrister like me. And he really did human rights law and developed it at a time when there wasn't really such a thing in the UK as human rights law. But he wanted to use the arguments available to him and to develop a jurisprudence on human rights, inspired largely by his experience in the United States. So he was fortunate enough to go to Harvard Law School on a funded fellowship and then to return. So that was in 1960. He then returned in 1964 and wrote a report for a very then young organization, Amnesty International, wrote a report having traveled around the South on race in the American South. And very much inspired by his work there, he then implemented the new tools, I guess you could say, throughout his legal practice in the UK. He was also a legislator. He was in the upper chamber, the House of Lords, in the UK Parliament. And so he really had the privilege, I guess, of two roles in his human rights practice. One, developing the principles through the courts as a barrister, but two, trying relentlessly, really, to implement legislation in the United Kingdom, most successfully in the form of the Human Rights Act, which was really a way of getting remedies for people affected by breaches of human rights in the English courts, rather than having to go to the international courts in Strasbourg. So that's really, in a nutshell, what he did.
And he was inspired by the civil rights movement, and I guess helped to lead the civil rights movement in the United States, starting back in the 60s.
Well, he would have, modestly said that was to credit him with leading the civil rights movement in the US is probably a bit over the top, but he certainly benefited enormously from his experiences in the 60s in the US. And really the idea of this fellowship is that my brother, who we'll come on to, who's at Bard College, and I, and my mother, also a lawyer, saw when we were growing up as a family what my father had taken from his international experience. Every member of my family, as it happened, has benefited from a time in the US. And my mother also was at Harvard Law School. My brother went to the US, where he remains as a US citizen. I had 2 stints in the US in law schools. And we saw the energy and drive, I think, that gave him. And he very much instilled in us the huge value of travel, of gaining different experiences. And I guess more specifically in his case, the real drive that gave his legal career, to see the principles that he saw being implemented in the United States at that time, which he found very energizing. And he certainly applied those very actively to his role in the United Kingdom. It's also true that he kept up those international connections. So we have very vivid memories of him always speaking to judges that he'd met overseas, attending conferences, keeping up those links. He had very active correspondence with people around the world, and was a great believer in cross-pollinization of ideas, so sharing ideas between different cultures in order to enrich each of them.
And what were some of those principles that are still with us today, perhaps in different context around the world?
Well, I think in particular, what he came home from the US to work on, almost in parallel with his law practice at that time, was race relations and equalities legislation. So in the 1970s, I think he was very affected at that time by 2 things about the United States. First, the racial injustice that he perceived in those early years in 1964 in his travels around the South, but then also the importance and value of having a written constitution and a Bill of Rights, which obviously one can debate the pros and cons of having that, but the United Kingdom doesn't have such a document. And I think he was really inspired by the framework that gave litigants in the United States who were able to secure remedies for breach of their rights, perhaps more directly than they could in the UK. So it was really, I think, those principles that guided him. And he then wrote a book, which I guess you could say summarizes the main ideas that inspired him. It's called 5 Ideas to Fight For. And he tracks in that book the ideas that he gained in the US, the energy that experience gave him, and how he regarded those principles as ones that were really important to stand up and fight for. Those 5 ideas were human rights, equality, free speech, free expression, privacy, and the rule of law. And he frames in that book the history of those ideas and why, in his view, they matter, and how, in his view, they were sort of under threat at that time in the United Kingdom.
And those ideas are still, being scrutinized and fought for in the United States and around the world as well. So the battle continues.
Absolutely, worldwide.
And those ideas he fought for back in the 60s, people like you and other lawyers fight for those ideas, both in the United States, Great Britain, and around the world today.
That's right. And I think another factor that really motivated my father was to try to instill in younger people and people thinking about perhaps career changes or early in their career, how they shouldn't be apathetic, but if they believed in something and they wanted to achieve, then they should go forward and not be stopped by anyone, but try and really work to achieve what you want in life. And I guess he would always instill in us the idea of law, as he put it, as a tool for social change. And so I guess we've been inspired by and wishing to really pave his legacy in those kinds of ideas of inspiring younger people and people wondering about what direction to take, to be able to have the financial capacity and support to be able to achieve something early in their careers in the same direction.
And that goes to the purpose of the scholarships in his honor.
Exactly.
And how would he feel about the immigration and the border issues today, both in Britain, the EU, and the United States?
Well, he was deeply troubled by problems relating to immigration, I think, at all points in his life. He would not have shied away from the complexities and the political hot potato that is immigration. And I think he was pretty critical of different elements of government policy over the years, and very interested in ideas of integration and equality. But I think for him, in a strange sense, he wasn't a very party political person, although he certainly worked for a new political party, the Social Democratic Party. He was part of founding in the 1980s in England, and he stood as a Labour Party candidate in the 1970s unsuccessfully, and then worked as a Liberal Democrat legislator in the House of Lords. But actually, he was not so concerned with the politics of immigration. He was more concerned with the impact of unequal laws and policies on individuals. So some of his pioneering cases, which were really the earliest cases brought in the European Court of Human Rights by the United Kingdom, were for people affected by different immigration policies. So I think he would have, not thought that this was a new problem at all, but a perpetual one that, the world is really struggling in different ways to deal with.
And the United States, too, has been struggling to find some way to resolve those issues, and it still is today.
Exactly.
I'd just like to remind our listeners, we're talking with Maya Lester, and she is a King's Counsel in Great Britain, and she's also the daughter of Anthony Lester, and we're talking about the Anthony Lester Fellowships offered through Bard College. And you're listening to Law You Should Know on 90.3 WHPC in Garden City, Long Island, New York. And if you missed any part of this program or you want to tell someone else about it, just go to nccradio.org. Let's go back to the scholarships in honor of your father. What is the goal and purpose of the fellowships, and who are they available to?
So the fellowships are available to law students and to lawyers early in their career from anywhere in the world. And it's really designed for people who want to have experiences overseas and to do something of practical value in the field of rule of law, human rights. We've called it field work, something of practical value. My father was not a huge supporter of purely academic projects, but wanted to do something in the real world. But people who couldn't otherwise afford to have that opportunity. So the fellowship gives a stipend to people who fall within that category in order to enable him to do that kind of work. We've left it pretty open-ended. So this can be a project of, your choosing. We've suggested a minimum of a 3-month project, but that is flexible. The idea is really to make sure that somebody is doing something for a length of time that enables them to, I guess, either achieve something real or certainly be launched onto a certain project. So the deadline for this year's fellowships is to apply by the 28th of March. With a brief written proposal explaining the project, with a resume or CV and 2 references. And we hope to announce the first 2 fellows. So we're offering at the moment 2 Lester Fellowships by the end of April. At the end of the fellowship, the fellows will be invited then to Bard College's campus in the Hudson Valley, very beautiful, to make a presentation to show people what it is that they've been achieving and doing on their project, and to write a short report. We very much hope that also they will have some engagement with some of the people that worked with my father on the Odysseus Trust, which was his political office, where he worked with a number of people on his goals, on his legal and legislative goals. So that's the idea.
And I believe to find out more information or to apply for the fellowships, anyone interested or want to find out more about it, to tell someone else, is apply.interfolio, interfolio.com/1388682. And we'll give that address, that website later in the program. Tell us more about your work, in a sense, inspired by your father or your own background and training.
I will happily do that. I just on the website, so that's a pretty complicated web address. But just to say, if you do enter into your search engine Lester Fellowships, you will see that there's a website at Bard College. and I want to, recognize the extremely valuable role of BARD in this fellowship, which I hope you'll ask me about in a moment. But they are administering and have an endowment for this fellowship to take place. But if you put into Google or your search engine BARD and Lester Fellowships, you'll see all of the information about how to apply. So I am also a barrister, and I practice also in the field of human rights. Also, other areas I practice in antitrust law a bit, and also what we would call public administrative constitutional law. But my real specialism over the past 10 years or so is in the law of economic sanctions. So the law relating to the very complex issue of the legal issues arising when, for example, the US imposes sanctions on Russia for its actions in Ukraine, or on Syria, counter-terrorist sanctions, Iran sanctions. And you can imagine that given the very complicated global interaction of different sanctions regimes, that's a complex and fascinating area.
And I guess the idea of sanctions can go back to the dealings between the British and the American colonies, if not before that.
Well, people date sanctions back to ancient Greece, to Athens imposing trade blockades. You're right. I mean, sanctions have a very long history. I think they've evolved a lot, particularly in the United States. But now I think what has really happened is that the attempt is to make sanctions fairer in some way by, instead of blockading a whole country where, United Nations worldwide sanctions in particular were seen to have had pretty adverse effects on civilian innocent populations. The idea is to try to target sanctions on, leaders and policymakers, and to have targeted lists of those who governments around the world are trying to impose pressure on. Whether that's achieved and whether, in fact, sanctions are well targeted is a whole other fascinating area of debate, but that's the idea.
And certainly sanctions are better than bullets or bombs in trying to achieve a goal. Well,
certainly less cost in terms of human life. That's absolutely right. And that's, I guess one reason why they have become an extremely popular tool for governments around the world. Whether they're effective is another question, but you're absolutely right. The normal justification for them is we have to do something, and for obvious reasons, we'd rather not send in the troops.
And they are a tool in encouraging behavior or in discouraging bad behavior.
Yes. I mean, that's normally the justification, is that they are trying to achieve a policy goal, whether that is trying to, ensure that Iran doesn't have a nuclear program, or trying to persuade President Putin to exit Ukraine and to choke off financial resources. They have, a policy goal, which they are designed to achieve largely through economic pressure.
And sometimes they're directed at countries on the sidelines to discourage them from joining one side or the other.
That's true. And the US in particular has a kind of sanctions called secondary sanctions, where they seek to dissuade, third countries, anyone in the world, from trading with countries that the US doesn't approve of their policies. So financial institutions, for example, around the world are very cautious about transactions with countries, for example, that the US doesn't want them to do business with. So you're right, there is a third country element to them too.
And from your work in dealing with sanctions, what can the U.S. or Great Britain or other countries, or the EU or other countries, do to put more teeth behind sanctions or to fine-tune them a little bit?
I think it really depends what sanctions regime you're talking about, because I think what recent sanctions experience is showing is that trying to impose pressure on a major power like Russia, that after all is able to trade with countries that don't share in our sanctions policies, China and many other jurisdictions, India, is a very difficult goal to try to achieve. And there are fierce debates in the press about, whether indeed they are achieving goals or not. And I'm in the fortunate position of being a humble lawyer and not a policy person in government. But I think your question is a very good one. And if we end up with sanctions on China, depending on what happens in relation to Taiwan, again, you have a very, very major power, very entwined with trade with the Western world. And so trying to use economic power to dissuade them in those circumstances is very difficult. I think it's different if you're trying to achieve a more limited goals, for example, trying to cut off terrorist financing through the use of pressure on the international banking system. That is a very different goal. So these are slippery things, and it really depends exactly what it is you're trying to do and how you measure effectiveness.
And if you go after some of those neutral countries or the countries not part of the system, let's say like in India, can it do more harm than good against the country and against the people in that country?
Well, possibly. I mean, I think there's no, current intention to impose sanctions on India in relation to anything like that. But I think your point is well made that the sort of collateral unintended effects of sanctions can be very significant. So it can be that, if you're put on a targeted sanctions list by, the West, as it were, it may be seen as a kind of badge of honor in certain parts of the world. Whether it has the slightest impact, of course, depends where you are likely to want to do business and to trade. But certainly the policymakers will be trying to achieve the goals of sanctions without that kind of collateral damage to individuals. It's a difficult thing to do. And given the political drivers are so strong to impose and ramp up and increase sanctions, sometimes it must be hard to get the balance right between not impacting on individuals adversely and achieving policy goals. And that, of course, classically is the human rights dilemma, where you get the clash of different principles between the interests of the state and the interests of the individual.
And achieving these balances is very important, to consider the pros and cons and the unintended consequences of different policies.
I would hope so. And you know better than me, with a radio station, these days debate gets very polarized. And all of these debates about that you've mentioned, whether it's sanctions, immigration, the whole field of human rights, it's easy sometimes to lose the nuance in what are very complex subjects.
Okay, I just wanted to remind our listeners, we're talking with Maya Lester, and she is a King's Counsel in Great Britain, and we're talking about the scholarships in honor of her father, the Anthony Lester Fellowships being offered by Bard College here in New York in the Hudson Valley. And you're listening to Law You Should Know on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nass Community College in Garden City, Long Island, New York. If you missed any portion of this program or you want to tell someone else about it, just go to nccradio.org. And just going back to your father for a second and his book and his writing, 5 Ideas to Fight For, what was some of the other, and that book is still available online and in many libraries, and what are some of the other principles that are even more relevant today that he was advocating and discussing back then? Well,
so this book was published in 2016, so not that long ago. Interestingly, in the United Kingdom context, it was published just before Brexit. So he didn't have the opportunity in that book to talk about that subject, but he did then write a more personal memoir called Talking to Myself, which we finished, and he largely finished it before he died. But that, in a sense, is a bit of an update of a more personal nature to the 5 Ideas book. But I think what is interesting about particularly the 5 Ideas to Fight For book is that it's a bit of a rallying cry, where he says, this is no time for apathy. And he's encouraging people to look at the history of those principles, the importance of protecting the rule of law, securing equality, and other principles, and really instilling in people reading the book in pretty simple terms the importance of fighting for some of these goals through active engagement. And so, just to quote a couple of lines to illustrate what I mean, he said in the 5 Ideas book, "I want to show that it is possible to bring about change and to encourage active engagement. I hope this book will encourage readers to fight for a more open, democratic society based on equal justice and the rule of law." And he ends the book by saying, "There is so much need for your active involvement in the pursuit of justice. Now over to you." And I guess that "now over to you" final remark is partly what inspired us and, the wonderful funders of this fellowship that I will mention in a moment, to, take up that offer of over to you and hopefully help people who wish themselves to help the world by protecting, not just the values that were dear to him, but anything broadly within those very wide categories of the rule of law and human rights, to try to achieve something that's important to them and to enable them to do something in that field.
And those ideas are more important than ever, because since his death, these rights of citizens and immigrants are being challenged around the world more than ever.
Yes. And certainly in the United Kingdom, also during his lifetime, even, the idea of human rights itself has become rather politicized in a way that I don't think he would have enjoyed. But, the degree of protection you give to human rights, which human rights, whose human rights, and what should the role of different institutions in that be? So what is it appropriate for a court to be deciding when it comes to human rights? How much should be in the sphere of the legislature rather than judges? All of those kinds of issues, which have been running through US legal thinking and UK and worldwide, really, are still very fresh and important today.
And we just have a moment or so left in the program, and I know you wanted to touch on some other points about your father's work and the legacy he left.
Well, I also just want to touch on the role of Bard College, because my brother Gideon Lester, who isn't in the law but is in the theatre world, has worked at Bard College for 12 years. And this was really his initiative, along with some wonderful people at Bard College. So he is the artistic director and chief executive of the Fisher Center for Performing Arts. But the importance of Bard is that they have the first undergraduate human rights program in the United States. They also have a pretty new center for the human rights and the arts, which both my brother and the wonderful director Tom Keenan are involved in. But it's really an endowment at Bard with funding from the Open Society University Network and the Gatsby Foundation, a UK foundation funded by Lord Sainsbury, and some funding from us, the Lester family, that has enabled this to take place. And we are very grateful to all of those institutions for taking this forward.
And Bard does offer, courses in the politics and the economics and the work and ideas of your father as well.
They do, and Bard also, importantly, I think, does a lot of practical human rights work. Just to give one example, it offers degree courses to those in a number of New York State prisons in its prison initiative. It has a number of different aspects to its human rights program. And so for all those reasons, plus, of course, the family connection, this seems like a natural home for this project. I should also say we're offering 2 fellowships in this first year. My personal hope is that if there is a great uptake and need for this kind of opportunity and people are inspired by it, that who knows, we may be able to reach out and offer more fellowships and more opportunities in further years. So we'd be really grateful for anyone who feels that they can spread the word about this opportunity to any institutions or individuals who might be interested worldwide. And
I just want to remind people the deadline is March 28th. And it's not good to wait till the deadline, but just Google Anthony Lester and Lester Fellowship for more information. And for more information on the other works and programs at Bard College, just go to bard.edu. And I would like to thank his daughter, Maya Lester, for being on guest on Law You Should Know.
Thank you.
And if you missed any part of the program, you want to tell someone else about it, just go to the podcast at nccradio.org. And please join us again next week at the same time for another program on Law You Should Know here on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College in Garden City, Long Island, New York.